Again, no kickbacks there, just wanting to share that with you. You may think there's no way we're getting done. Guys, these next two just fly, right? So we get to delivery. This is the one everybody talks about, but I think it has more to do with just who you are. So let me give you a few things with regard to delivery. What you don't want to do is listen to a Billy Graham sermon and try and repeat him. Because if you're in a congregation of 50 and you go, I see them coming, thousands upon thousands, you're going to sound stupid. You want to be you, whoever God made you to be. So a few things. When it comes to delivering the message well, this is, remember now, I'm an old debate guy, I'm an old forensics guy, I'm an old DJ, I have time as a TV reporter. That's who I am. So I'm going to give you a few things that are probably not out of a homiletics class. And if anybody taken homiletics, where they teach you to breathe and to really make a point. It depends on the kind of homiletics teacher you have. I would say, first of all, de-homileticize yourself if you really want to connect with this culture. But one of the things I would say this is signpost. Most people won't read an email if it doesn't have bullet points. Did you know that? If they look at it, even if it says important email, you're going to be audited. If it's not got bullet points, I ain't reading that, right? They want to see white space. They want to see easy to read. The verbal version of bullets is called signposting. And that means if you have an outline, not only does it come up on the Mondo screen behind me, not only I say, point number one. Let me take you to our second point. Okay, for the third point. And there's something really empowering to them when they feel like they're following you and they know the outline. So a lot of you have an outline and you expect somebody to be able to follow you and they're filling in the blanks. The clearer you are, the clearer the message is. So signposting where you are in the outline is absolutely huge. Have an introduction and a conclusion well thought out. You want to know why messages go too long sometimes? It's because we didn't plan for a conclusion. And so we're trying to land the plane and we're kind of hem-hawing around and we don't know where to go. But if we have a good introduction and a good conclusion, then we're going to have a good message. And give yourself what we call an inclusio whenever you can. Inclusio is a literary term that you see often in Scripture. Got your Bibles with you? I need somebody to look up Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. And somebody else to look up Matthew 28, verse 20. Who's got Matthew 1:23?
The virgin will be with the child and will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us.
Which means God with us. The very beginning, the story, God with us. Somebody read Matthew 28, verse 20.
Teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age.
What's the commonality between those two verses?
God is with you.
God's with you. The book of Matthew has a giant inclusio. It begins with the message that Christ would come to be God with us. And Jesus leaves by saying, and I will be with you always. It wraps that whole book together, right? When you start with an illustration or a point, and then you preach a message, and when you come to the end, and you refer back to that, or you have language that ties back to what you said at the beginning, do you know what that does in the mind of the viewer? You know what that does in the mind of the, they're like, oh, he just put a bow on that. And they know it's wrapping up, and they feel like a complete thought. It's called an inclusio. You can find it all over the book of Psalms. You can find it all over New Testament narratives. It's when the beginning and the end have a natural connection point, and when the hearer makes that connection, it gives them a sense of finality. So these are very huge 30,000-foot things. Signpost. Make your outline a verbal outline. Have an introduction and conclusion that's planned so you know how to start, not hem-hawing, and you know how to land the plane. And then use an inclusio whenever you can, because that gives a sense of confidence to your listener. As we roll through this, the 4 elements of examine, argue, illustrate, apply, let me just give you some delivery points related to that. As in the arena of examine, preachers should not share absolutely everything they know. Remember what we said before, only a fraction. Don't try and cram all the knowledge in at once. If you're going to preach there for more than a year, you might want to come back to the passage. Save yourself some work. Sound good? Second, don't outpunt your coverage. Transparency is not always something we voluntarily offer, and if language study is not your forte, don't make it the backbone of your message delivery. Everyone will know, and it will diminish the God-given message that you have. You should touch on language, but don't make it the backbone if you don't speak the language. If you're not a history guy, then don't go into all the history. So make sure that you're focusing on your strengths, on the way God has made you. Still, we're in examine. Ensure that the biblical text is the topic and not a commentary, blog post, or other things about the passage. Kathy, we need a comma after commentary, if you would remember that for the notes. Be familiar enough with the Bible study that you are free of your notes, but not afraid to reference them to leave out important content. The reason that we have these 4 things is they help you in your memorization, but don't be afraid to use notes. Matter of fact, you want to see something obnoxious? I don't even care. I'm a huge fan of journaling. I shared with you that we have one in your swag bag. Here's the size of my journal. I walk up to the platform with it every weekend, and I know it may look a little obnoxious to you, and that's just because I'm 51 and blind. So let me give quiet time. Jude. This may look like chicken scratches to you, but if you look real close, point. Examine, argue, illustrate, apply. Examine, argue, illustrate, apply. There it is. And so that doesn't give me a lot of information, but all I have to do is go, oh yeah. That's all this is. This is my oh yeah book. So I preach from that. Does that make sense? And if you get familiar enough with the model, then that can happen for you to be freer of notes. How many of you are manuscript guys, by the way? You're studs. I don't know how you do it. I just do not know how you do it. You write a book every week. That's great. So let's go through argue. We're going to rifle through these pretty quick. Argue. When speaking for the skeptic and discussing argumentation, ensure you're not demeaning. I learned this lesson a long time ago when I talked about atheists. And I made the statement that I don't know how you could be so dumb as to be an atheist. And then I made some great illustration that just totally decimated atheism. Didn't matter though. The 16-year-old girl who was in the crowd with purple hair and the nose ring looked at me and she goes, I want you to know I stopped listening to you when you said that. And she just walked away. Powerful lesson. I thank her for it. And I've been sad for it ever since. Right? So even though you're arguing with them, don't be demeaning in that argumentation. Find a point of connection in argumentation and offer some vulnerability about having similar questions in your own life, or at least that it is something about which they should not be embarrassed. If you find a point of argumentation, you go, I understand, that's a hard question. Or absolutely, when you struggle with that's a very common struggle, and I'm thankful that you're here. During argumentation, it's encouraged to slow your pace and tone and speak more like a consoling counselor than a heralding preacher. If you know you're going to hit a soft spot, don't you love when the doctor touches you and goes, does that hurt? Ow, yes, that hurts. That's why I came in. How about now? Yes, it still hurts. Quit doing that. Don't be that doctor, right? If you know that's the point that it hurts, then treat that spot with a little bit of love and tenderness. Illustration. They can be humorous, informative, and emotional, but they should not distract from the overall message or dominate the time spent delivering it. The best illustration I've ever heard, funniest illustration I've ever heard, it's at this point in the afternoon. Can I just do this for you? A friend of mine who's a pastor at another church, he was actually my youth pastor for several years. He tells a story about when he was early on in ministry and he was poor and was borrowing somebody's car in the church, and they let him have this huge Cadillac. And so he was coming up over this hill, and he saw a cat dart out, and all he felt was whoomp, whoomp. Felt really bad, man. And so he got out, he was looking, didn't find the cat, and then off in the grass in this front yard, there's just this cat laying there with its tail flicking. He's like, oh no, it's still alive. So he went in the trunk of his car, and the only thing he could find in there was a hammer. And he did not want to do this, right? But he couldn't leave this cat there suffering, so he got down over the cat. He said a little prayer. He raised up that hammer and just killed the cat. And as soon as the hammer came down, he heard, what are you doing? From a woman on the porch. He says, oh, I hit your cat with my car. And she's like, no, you hit it with the hammer. And she called the police, and he thought about running, but he goes, no, that's not going to work. So he waited, and the police came, and then he explained to the officer, listen, I hit it, and I didn't. He goes, I'm so sorry. Yeah, he goes, let me take care of it. She's a little upset. He goes, I'm just going to take your information. He went back, wrote down this guy's license number, came back, says, you need to get out of here. He says, why? He goes, because the cat that you hit is actually under your wheel well. So this dude killed an incredibly passive cat with a hammer in a front yard. But the cop understood, Okay, great story, right? I have no idea what he was preaching on that. I remember that story. I've told that story. It's hilarious. It makes me sick to my. I laugh. I sometimes giggle all to myself. I see him, and I only think of that. Have no idea what he was preaching that day. Good illustration or bad illustration? Bad illustration. right?
But now it's a good illustration.
for this. But it's a bad illustration because it distracts. And so you need to, there are some things that are absolutely hilarious. Some things that are incredibly connective. You need to make sure where you place them, how you place them, and what emphasis you give. Because if you distract from the message, you're not helping it, you're hindering it. Does that make sense? Illustration. Your family members should always approve illustrations using your family. And if, and if there's any chance someone might consider it embarrassing for a wife or child, the preacher should make sure they declare their permission to share the story. I'm like, hey, I checked with my wife, and she said it was okay for me to share this. Because if I don't say that, even if I did have permission, there's still people going, oh, he should not have shared that. Right? My kids, do you know how my kids, it was great. I paid them $5 an illustration. Right? And they loved it. Matter of fact, my youngest would go, do you need me to do something stupid? I ain't kidding you, man. It was so much fun to do that. And there were a couple. My oldest son was a little more concerned. He was like, I had this story about him getting a spanking, the last spanking that he ever got. And I said, boy, that'd be a great illustration. He goes, no, I don't want you to tell him that. Honor it. Not going to fight it. Absolutely. About 4 years later, he's older, almost graduated from high school. It's Easter. I was going to use it on a normal weekend, but it's Easter. Man, I'd love to use it. I say, hey, do you remember this? He goes, oh, yeah. I go, do you mind if I use that now? He goes, I don't care. Sure. It was God's sovereignty, man. Because I was going to waste it on a normal weekend, and it was a great story for Easter. But make sure you get their permission in doing so. Let me tell you, you want to raise pastors' kids? Don't ask their permission. You want to raise kids? Ask their permission. Don't make them pastor examples. Right? Great illustrations are simple, and object lessons involving everyday items will cause everyday recall, which is the goal. Have you ever seen the illustration where the children's pastor takes the vial and there's water in it, and then she puts a dropper of something in, and then she pours something else in, and it clears it all? Okay. But, you know, Bill Nye the Science Guy is there to do the lesson that day. How about this? Anybody know what I'm holding? What is this? Very good. Everybody knows that. But here's what I want to really know. Do you know how much water is in a water bottle? How much?
12 ounces.
12 ounces? Somebody else? 16.9. Is that the weirdest number? 16.9. Why is it 16.9 ounces? Well, right in parentheses under it, it says 500 milliliters. Well, that's the issue. The rest of the world's on the metric system, and it's an even 500 milliliters because they're all communists. But in America, it is 16.9 ounces. Can I get an amen in the house? To use something like this, to use a water bottle, when you do that as an illustration, people, every time they see a water bottle for the next week, guess what they're going to do?
You're a communist.
Oh, yeah. That's a communist. Yeah, that's a communist water bottle. They'll remember it because it's common. The next time they see somebody mixing chemicals in beakers, that doesn't happen, right? So your object lessons that are simple and provocative are the best ones out there. You may be looking for something complex, and it actually is less effective than something simple. So keep those illustrations where they need to be. Consider using a polar opposite if an illustration is needed but hard to create. So, for example, if you'd like to use a story of victory, a story of abject failure might give the same preaching power. 9 times out of 10, when I tell a story about Andy, Andy's the idiot in the story, right? Because I failed. If I want to tell a story about great victory, I talk about my wife. If I want to talk about abject failure, I talk about me. But they can both do the same thing. So here's my advice to you. Have you ever just sat there and pounded your head going, I need an illustration for this. I need an illustration. Whatever you're thinking about, flip the script and think of the complete opposite, because you can make the same application so long as it's a strong polar opposite. Make sense? A lifestyle preacher, this is probably the most important thing in this section that I can give you. A lifestyle preacher needs to keep an easy-to-reference catalog of potential illustrations they harvest from their life conversations, reading, media, etc. So, I have on my phone something called Tap Forms. It's a database that translates to all my devices, and I have almost 4,000 personal illustrations. And how do I come by those? let's just say, I had this idea while we're here. Hey Siri, add to my illustrations list water bottle illustration. There it is. And at the end of the week, when I go and I do all this, the first thing that I do is I take all of those and I enter them into tap forms, and I see all the newest illustrations that I have. I have 4,000 illustrations, of which I think I've only used about 3,200, because 800 of them I just added, and then I'll be able to go back and reference. So here's the issue. As a lifestyle preacher, you're going to go through your whole week and stuff's going to happen. Have you ever noticed, because you're a preacher, weird stuff happens to you? Have you ever noticed that you have unusual experiences? Write them all down, even if you don't know what they're going to be used for. Put them all in a catalog, because at some point you're going to use those. Last September, I was running in San Antonio. I was at a conference. I'm running. And nobody, right? That's the way that should work. I was trying to get in shape, and I'm running on the Riverwalk, passed out. Boom. Hit the ground. Smash. Broke my nose. Fire department. Everybody comes. Take my first ambulance ride. Go to the hospital. It's a big old hairy mess. When I got done with that, it was embarrassing because I had to go to the conference the next day. Couldn't fly home for 2 days. I mean, I'm just a mess. My face is all swollen, this and that. But here was my first thought. I don't know where this is going to come in handy, but broken nose, San Antonio. and it ended up being not only one of the best, it was one of those illustrations that I used, first point, second point, third point. When my face was all swollen at church, here's what I said. You may have noticed, I broke my nose. Right? Then I preached, first point, got to the need for an illustration. You may have noticed, I broke my nose. Everybody laughs. Get to the third point, need an illustration. You may have noticed, I broke. By the time I hit the fourth point, I stop and go, you may have noticed, the whole congregation, I broke my nose. Right? And it was coming out of life. So I want to encourage you, use a database, a spreadsheet or something, but just get in the habit of anything that might potentially be a teaching moment and write it down, because you'll use it later, right? That you need to build illustrations constantly.
You keep a variety in that too, because if like you run a lot, you don't want to use that same illustration every week or same. Am I right in thinking that you got to try to diversify those
Sure.
illustrations so that way it doesn't become repetitious?
And don't use sports all the time either. As much as you like that, a good chunk of your crowd doesn't care. Don't use hunting all the time. Who's the current, Ben Mandrell, the current CEO of LifeStyle? I heard him speak at Midwest Leadership Advance last January, and here's what he said. Pastors, go out and do some interesting stuff. You need some interests, because if you don't have interests, you're not interesting. Say, if all you talk about is the church and preach, no one's going to identify with you. And so it's about having that variety of experience. When we get to the last section, I'm going to talk about some study places. Absolutely. Are illustrations easy or hard for you guys to come up with? I mean, or does it just depend on the week?
Depends on the week.
Depends on the week. Okay. One way to collect that data is to create a notes file on your phone. I just shared that with you, sorry. However, long-term storage, that is the tap forms that I want to talk about. Finally, application. While this workshop is instructed for the lifestyle preacher to use all 4 elements in each point, the application may be the exception. There'll be sermons where the application best fits the end with the singular next step. That's actually my favorite. I very often hold off on application till a final next step, because we want to do a very physical, here's what we want you to do as a response. So instead of applying every point, we'll apply at the very end. Application is often the most challenging concept to include because of the difficulty of specific actions and next steps. The degree of difficulty in including application may also be a key to its importance. And can I say that that is true? As I listened to all 3 of your groups, you all had application, nobody was specific. We need to lay it down. We need to release it. A real application is you need to go to the Next Step Center and pray with a counselor to release whatever it is that God is telling you to do. Does that make sense? You feel the call to missions? Well, don't just pray about that. Why don't you go today and sign up, because at the Next Steps counter, we have a short-term mission proposal for you to be a part of, and you need to jump on that today while you're still thinking about it. So application being very firm and real. The application should not appear as a thing to do, but a response in worship. Say, this is not a works-oriented thing for you. This is me encouraging you to follow through on what God's asked you to do. All right, before we go on to audience analysis, any thoughts on those? Those are just some delivery pieces for examine, argue, illustrate, apply. Thoughts, pushback, endorsements? Yes.
Advantages to phrasing application in question form.
Give me an example, or explain.
Well, just thinking about like taking the points that you're trying to convey, the main point of the message, and hey, what are you going to do with this? Why does this matter to you? Because if it's easy, the specific steps of being called to missions, right? That speaks to that group, right? Versus the other people. And so casting the net of what that might mean to people that are listening.
So instead of giving them that, saying you need to ask yourself the question and follow through.
Right.
I think there are times that really could work, but if you do that all the time, it could be an easy out for you not, because I think application is one of the hardest things to come up with for the general audience. So yeah, I think on the basis of sermon to sermon, ask yourself the question, is that the right response or not? But yeah, I definitely wouldn't take that off the table for sure. Sure. And others, pushback, endorsement, thoughts?
As a fellow Logos evangelist, I'm disappointed that you didn't also tap into Logos for your illustrations. Definitely, there's some great resources out there,
Yeah.
and that's been very helpful. I really like Tony Evans' book on his illustrations, and it's so nice because then some of the illustration books will be tapped also with passages, and so a lot of times, even if I don't use theirs, reading theirs, that sparks the one that I had, a similar example that I might have had.
Absolutely. So you're just launching off theirs.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let me give you one other thing because I love that track you're going on. To use that, but not only that, if you're preaching I have a personal practice, you don't have to adopt this. If I preach in the New Testament, one of my illustrations will be an Old Testament reference or story. If I'm preaching out of the Old Testament, one of my references will be a New Testament passage or story. That way, we have so many biblically illiterate people in our congregation that I'm actually, when I do that, you know what I'm doing? I'm teaching a children's church sermon in the middle of the sermon. Right? So that's a great way to make sure that you're biblically inclusive and that you're teaching the whole counsel. Audience analysis. Let your sermons mirror public media. I know that sounds like a horrible statement, but what I mean by that is, do you know that almost all newspapers are written at the 8th grade level? And online newspapers and magazines as well. 8th grade. If you're preaching at a high school or collegiate level, you are leaving your people behind. We need to dumb it down. I'm not going to give names because that would be wrong, even though we've rekindled a relationship and everything's okay. But there was a guy, I preached the annual message for our state convention, and when I got done, here's how he came off. He says, "Thank you, Brother Andy, for putting something on the bottom shelf where everybody could read it." Yeah, what do you think he meant by that? By the way, that guy met me at the SBC convention 4 years later, pulled me out and said, "I am so sorry I did that." So then, first of all, I knew he did it on purpose. but things have rekindled. But that was a cut. It's like, oh, you're just one of those simple preachers. I'd rather be a simple preacher who makes a difference and feels like I'm faithful and obedient to God than impress other preachers. Right? So let your sermons mirror the public media. And by the way, go back to this. Let your sermons mirror public media. What level did Jesus preach at? Did he preach at his own level? He did not, did he? He met the needs of those who are around him. Include something for the long-term believer. This is what we were talking about, Todd, earlier. The long-term believer and Bible student who's probably heard most of this before. So talk to the 8th grader at the 8th grade language, but always have one thing that Bible scholar in your church can go, oh, that was really good. I look for that one thing, and I start in my notes. I go, that's going to be fun for whoever. And I actually here's the way this works. I preach to the lowest common denominator, but I try and find one thing that my wife will go, it was awesome when you said. I want one of those every message. And engage the senses. This is where lifestyle preaching might come into play. See it, hear it, feel it, say it, taste it. There we go. Now, how in the world do you do this? Kathy, would you play along with me real quick? Would you?
Sure.
We did this once. Love God.
Grow up, serve all.
Who's the church?
Yeah.
We have all these phrases that we say at church and they call in response, that we have learned them. They're bits of our theology and our discipleship process. Yeah, everybody say love. Love, like a creepy midnight DJ. That's how we say it. So, for a long time, the church was only an auditory experience. You came, nobody read, nobody had copies. All they could do was hear. We're not that place anymore. You can see it on the screens. You can hear it preached. How do you feel it? You put notes in their hands and they write it out tactily. How do you say it? I make them talk to me all the time. Repeat it back. I don't think you heard that. Say it to me. and make them say that, and even taste it. I think taste it? That's weird. Not so much so. If I start talking about barbecue, oh my goodness, I'm talking about southern, not vinegar based, but I'm talking about sweet honey barbecue with cornbread. Is anybody feeling me yet? I don't have to go very far. And then you follow that up with some chocolate cream pie. All we have to, you can engage the senses. After lunch, it's really hard because you guys are like, oh, I don't need anything else. But you can engage the senses. But then there are obvious places where you actually get to do that. The Lord's Supper. Oh my goodness. Taste and see that the Lord is good. When he said that, I wonder if we can remember and taste and see that he is good with this. And engage all those senses simply because we have the opportunity to do that. How did I do that? So you have to see them all again. Maybe the Lord really wants you guys to see these. Here we go. Then journaling. As well, I've talked about this several times. A handwritten version of your outline fosters retention. I showed you how I wrote that out there. You may not be you may be an iPad person or a manuscript person or whatever, but if you will just take a minute, and on Saturdays right before the message, I always handwrite out that outline with examine, argue, illustrate, apply. Do you know what it does? There is a connection, a natural human connection, that when you do this, it locks it in here. It gives you the ability, it's tactile recognition, and it helps you in retaining the message. It actually gets you tuned into what you've already done. A handwritten journal will never run out of batteries or receive a syntax error. You're never going to do what I did and click the wrong button and lose your journal. Does that make sense? It's always there. And also, a series of handwritten journals on your bookshelf are awesome. You just feel really cool. You know what I'm talking about? I have 2 shelves that are full of just years of journals. And they're great because I have an assistant who has turned them all into electronic PDFs. I can go back to any message in the last 10 years and tell you the day I preached it, the passage, and the examine, argue, illustrate, and apply of every message for 10 years because of that. So, time to move to dissect. Yes, go ahead.
You may have already answered this, I'm sorry if you have. So what do you bring up with you on a Sunday morning to preach? I'm assuming you get your scripture, but what does the paper or iPad look like when you're preaching?
Yeah, this was it. What I walk up there with is this journal open to wherever I've taken those most recent notes. But then I also have my PowerPoint on a 56-inch TV behind me that I'm controlling. And so everything that I have is out of this. I have 1 copy of Scripture in a preaching Bible, and then the notes behind me. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you don't write out your sermons word for word.
No, I've never been a manuscripter. And like I said, you guys are studs who do that. I have no idea. You need to teach a course on that. I don't know how you do that every week. Like my location pastor in Hutch, he's a manuscript writer, and he preaches it twice to himself before the weekend. I have never once preached to the air by myself. I am not St. Francis of Assisi. I do not do that. And so I'm an extemporaneous guy. I come off, that's why I like the 4 things, because they help remind me. But yeah, don't write it out anymore. I don't write it out any more than that. Again, eat the fish, spit out the bones. I'm giving you a model, not the model.